The world has never stood still. Empires rise like waves under the moon's pull, swelling with ambition, power, and prosperity, only to recede, leaving behind broken harbors and abandoned routes where caravans once passed. The collapse of great empires from the ancient to the medieval era reshaped not only borders but also the arteries of global exchange. For as long as humans have traded, the pulse of commerce has followed the rhythm of political might. When power waned, so too did the flow of silk, gold, and spices that connected civilizations. This chapter traces the long twilight of empires and the silent fading of the roads they once guarded, from Rome's ruin to the Mongol disintegration, from the fall of Constantinople to the shifting sands of the Sahara. It is the story of how the fall of kingdoms fractured the world's markets, forcing traders and explorers to search for new seas, new lands, and new fortunes. At its height, the Roman Empire stretched from the cold frontiers of Britannia to the warm harbors of Alexandria. Its roads, famously paved and ordered, became veins through which trade and tribute flowed. From the east came silk and spices, from Africa, ivory and gold, from Gaul and Hispania, wine and olive oil. Merchants thrived under the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, which guaranteed safe passage through lands once torn by tribal warfare. But peace is a fragile luxury. By the 3rd century CE, the empire began to tremble under its own weight. The borders grew too vast, the army too costly, and the emperors too numerous. The once unified world split into east and west, and trade faltered. Raiders plundered caravans. Roads fell into disrepair. Cities that had once echoed with the voices of Greek, Latin, and Phoenician traders turned quiet. When Rome fell in 476 CE, the Western world entered what later historians would call the Dark Ages. Though trade did not disappear entirely, it was no longer the lifeblood of a unified Mediterranean economy. Instead, small local exchanges replaced grand transcontinental routes. Merchants still ferried goods across the sea, but piracy and war made every voyage uncertain. Byzantium endured for 1,000 years more, but even there, the spirit of ancient commerce began to dim. The fall of Rome did not just end an empire, it ended an era of secure, predictable trade. Without imperial armies to guard the roads, traders turned to smaller, safer routes or retreated into local markets. The vast network that had once connected Europe to Asia through Rome's ports and caravan stations fragmented into countless isolated threads. As the Western Empire crumbled, the Byzantine Empire rose in the east as its heir. Constantinople, glittering between two continents, became the new hub of global exchange. Merchants from China, India, and Arabia unloaded cargo at its docks. Silk, spices, and gems flowed through its markets. The city was a living bridge between East and West. But even this mighty empire was not immune to the shifting tides of power. The rise of the Sasanian Persian Empire challenged Byzantine control over Eastern trade. The two empires fought bitter wars for centuries, wars that drained treasuries and left caravan routes in ruins. Trade between Asia and Europe slowed as the lands between the Tigris and the Mediterranean became battlefields. Then, in the 7th century, a new force emerged from the Arabian deserts, the Islamic Caliphate. Swift and inspired, Muslim armies conquered Persia, Syria, Egypt, and North Africa. With the old Byzantine-Persian rivalry erased, a new network of trade arose under Islamic rule. The caliphates united vast territories under a single religion, language, and currency, allowing merchants once again to travel safely from Cordoba to Samarkand. For several centuries, Islamic cities became the centers of global trade. Baghdad glittered with markets full of Indian spices, Chinese silks, and African ivory. Cairo and Damascus bustled with merchants and scholars. Knowledge traveled alongside goods, mathematics from India, astronomy from Persia, and papermaking from China all flowed westward through Muslim lands. Yet even this golden age would wane. The fragmentation of the Islamic world into rival caliphates, and later the Mongol invasions of the 13th century, destabilized the unity that had made this system thrive. Few empires in history inspired as much awe and terror as the Mongol Empire. Born from the windswept steppes of Central Asia, it united the largest contiguous land empire the world has ever known. When Genghis Khan and his successors conquered China, Persia, and Russia, they forged something remarkable, the Pax Mongolica, or Mongol peace. For nearly a century, under Mongol rule, caravans could travel from Venice to Beijing without crossing a single hostile border. The Silk Road, which had been fractured for centuries, was reborn. Mongol escorts protected caravans. Relay stations offered food, water, and shelter. Trade flourished as never before. Silk, gunpowder, porcelain, and paper money moved westward, gold, silver, and glassware flowed eastward. Even distant Europe benefited, as merchants like Marco Polo journeyed across Asia, bringing back tales of the wonders of Cathay. But the Mongol peace was fleeting. Empires born in conquest seldom survived the passing of their founders. As the great Khanates, in China, Persia, and Russia, turned on each other, trade once again became perilous. The Black Death, carried by fleas on trade ships and caravans, spread along these very routes, decimating populations and paralyzing commerce. The world that had been connected under the Mongols began to unravel. By the 15th century, the once bustling Silk Road lay quiet again. Cities like Kashgar and Samarkand, once jewels of commerce, faded into dust. The shifting sands of Central Asia literally covered parts of the old caravan trails, a haunting symbol of how the fall of an empire can bury even the memory of its roads. If there was one event that symbolized the final closing of the ancient trade routes, it was the fall of Constantinople in 1453. The city that had stood for more than 1,000 years, the link between Europe and Asia, fell to the Ottoman Turks. With it, the last barrier between Christian Europe and the Islamic world vanished, and the land routes to the east became tightly controlled. The Ottoman Empire now stood astride the crossroads of the ancient world. They levied taxes on goods passing through their lands, driving up the prices of spices and silks in Europe. European merchants, unable to compete, began to seek alternative paths to Asia, not by land, but by sea. Thus, the loss of one empire led to the birth of a new era. The fall of Constantinople indirectly ignited the age of exploration. When caravans could no longer pass safely through Asia, ships began to set sail around Africa and across the Atlantic. The ancient roads, the Silk Road, the Spice Route, the Incense Trail, gave way to the maritime routes of Vasco da Gama and Christopher Columbus. The world's trade had shifted from sand to sea. Across the deserts of North Africa, the trans-Saharan trade routes had once thrived. For centuries, caravans laden with gold, salt, and slaves crossed the dunes between West Africa and the Mediterranean. Kingdoms like Ghana, Mali, and Songhai flourished on this desert wealth. Timbuktu became a beacon of learning and trade, where scholars debated alongside merchants. But the desert is a harsh master. When climate change brought long droughts and the Sahara expanded, many of these routes became impassable. As North African ports grew richer from Mediterranean and later Atlantic trade, the old desert routes withered. The rise of European maritime trade diverted Africa's wealth toward the coasts, where Portuguese and Spanish ships began trading directly for gold and slaves. The mighty camel caravans dwindled to memory. The fall of these routes marked another turn in the world's shifting trade geography. From inland empires to coastal colonies, from caravans to ships. Each empire that fell gave birth to another that learned from its ashes. The fall of the Mongols created opportunities for the Ottomans, the Mughals, and the Safavids. The collapse of Rome allowed new powers in Western Europe to rise. Yet what changed most was not just who ruled, it was how trade itself was imagined. In the Old World, trade followed roads and rivers. In the New World, it would follow winds and currents. The fall of empires pushed humanity to think beyond borders. Venice, Genoa, and later Lisbon and Seville became the new centers of global trade. Merchants no longer waited for caravans from the east, they sent ships to find the source themselves. This transformation marked the true shift from the medieval to the modern world. The loss of ancient trade routes did not end global commerce, it reinvented it. Where the empires of the past had guarded their roads, the empires to come would command the seas. The ruins of the old world still whisper stories. The crumbling arches of Palmyra, the silent gates of Samarkand, the buried stones of Petra, all are reminders of a time when traders and travelers carried more than goods, they carried civilization itself. Every empire that fell took with it a piece of that living network. Yet, paradoxically, every collapse also sparked renewal elsewhere. The decline of Rome opened Europe to reinvention. The Mongol disintegration pushed Europe toward exploration. The fall of Constantinople redirected world trade toward the oceans, and, ultimately, toward the birth of the modern global economy. The shifting sands of trade were not just metaphorical. Desert winds buried cities, river courses changed, ports silted up. Nature, too, played its role in erasing the old paths. But human ambition, the desire to connect, to trade, to discover, never vanished. It simply found new directions. By the end of the 15th century, the ancient trade routes that had bound the continents together for millennia had largely disappeared. The age of land empires had given way to the age of maritime empires. The caravans of silk and spice had turned into fleets of sails and cannons. The roads of the New World were made not of stone or sand, but of waves, invisible paths across the oceans, linking continents as no road ever had. Yet, in a way, the sea routes carried the same spirit as the old Silk Road, a hunger for knowledge, for wealth, for the unknown. The fall of empires, the loss of roads, the shifting of sands, all these were but stages in humanity's endless voyage toward connection. The roads may crumble, but the journey never ends. The 15th century is marked a turning point in human history. For millennia, trade had flowed across dusty caravan paths and narrow sea lanes, connecting great civilizations, from China and India to Arabia and Europe. But by the early 1400s, those familiar routes were faltering. The Mongol Empire, which once secured the Silk Road, had long disintegrated. The Ottoman Empire controlled the eastern Mediterranean and demanded high taxes from European merchants seeking Asian goods. As spices, silks, and precious metals grew ever more expensive, Europe's merchants and monarchs turned their gaze seaward. Driven by hunger for wealth, curiosity, and faith, they launched voyages into the unknown. What began as small coastal expeditions along Africa soon grew into a full-scale global transformation. In less than 2 centuries, European powers would carve out empires stretching from the Americas to Asia, creating new trade systems that redefined wealth, labor, and power. The world became, for the first time, truly connected. This was the global trade revolution, and its roots lay in both ambition and necessity. Portugal, a small nation on the western edge of Europe, became the first to step into this new age. Under Prince Henry the Navigator, the Portuguese built schools of navigation and ship design, producing the nimble caravels that could withstand Atlantic winds. In the early 1400s, Portuguese sailors explored the West African coast, trading gold, ivory, and, tragically, enslaved people. In 1488, Bartholomew Dias reached the Cape of Good Hope, proving that the Indian Ocean could be accessed from the Atlantic. Just a decade later, Vasco da Gama completed the dream, sailing around Africa to reach Calicut, India, in 1498. His voyage shattered the monopoly of Muslim and Venetian traders over the spice trade. Portugal established forts along African coasts, in Goa, Malacca, and even Macau, building the first European maritime empire. Meanwhile, Spain pursued a different path. Backed by Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand, Christopher Columbus sought a western route to Asia. In 1492, he landed instead in the Caribbean, unknowingly unveiling a new world to European eyes. The following decades saw Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro conquer the vast Aztec and Inca empires, flooding Europe with silver and gold. This flood of bullion fueled both prosperity and inflation. Spanish galleons carried American silver across the Atlantic, while Portuguese ships ferried spices and silk from Asia. These twin empires, Spain and Portugal, set off the first true wave of globalization. But along with wealth came devastation. Indigenous civilizations were decimated by war and disease, and millions of Africans were enslaved to labor in the new colonies. Still, the dream of empire had begun, and other European powers soon joined the race. By the early 1600s, the Iberian dominance began to wane. The Dutch Republic, newly freed from Spanish rule, burst onto the global scene. Dutch merchants, backed by advanced finance and shipbuilding, founded the Dutch East India Company, VOC, in 1602, the world's first multinational corporation. The VOC established trading posts from the Cape of Good Hope to Java, eventually seizing the spice trade from the Portuguese. The Dutch were not conquerors but traders. Amsterdam became a hub of global commerce, its stock exchange and merchant fleet symbolizing a new capitalist order. Through their vast networks, they connected the East Indies, Africa, and the Americas, carrying goods like nutmeg, cinnamon, sugar, and coffee. France, too, sought its share. It established colonies in Canada, the Caribbean, and parts of India. The French Caribbean islands of Saint-Domingue and Martinique produced sugar and coffee with enslaved labor, enriching French ports like Nantes and Bordeaux. Yet it was England that would emerge as the greatest beneficiary of this new world order. The English East India Company, chartered in 1600, expanded trade in textiles, tea, and spices across Asia. Meanwhile, English colonists settled North America, establishing a transatlantic economy tied to agriculture, shipping, and slavery. By the late 17th century, England's navy dominated the seas. Its merchants, protected by a powerful state and guided by emerging mercantilist theory, began to shape the rules of global trade itself. The age of empire had entered a new and competitive phase. At the heart of early modern imperialism was mercantilism, the belief that a nation's power depended on its accumulation of wealth, especially gold and silver. Governments viewed trade as a zero-sum game, one country's gain was another's loss. Thus, they sought to control colonies as sources of raw materials and markets for finished goods. European states chartered joint stock companies to expand trade and colonization, granting them quasi-governmental powers. The British East India Company and Dutch VOC ruled distant territories, signed treaties, and commanded private armies. The triangular trade epitomized the new global system. European goods were shipped to Africa, exchanged for enslaved people, who were then transported to the Americas under horrific conditions. There, they were sold to work on plantations producing sugar, tobacco, and cotton, commodities sent back to Europe. Profits from these trades fueled industrial growth and financial innovation, but at a staggering human cost. Colonies were forbidden from trading freely, they were bound to the mother country. This system enriched European nations while trapping colonies in dependence, a pattern that would shape centuries of global inequality. No story of the global trade revolution is complete without confronting its darkest legacy, the transatlantic slave trade. Between the 16th and 19th centuries, over 12 million Africans were forcibly taken from their homelands. Torn from families, packed in ships under unimaginable conditions, and sold across the Americas, they became the backbone of the colonial economy. On plantations in the Caribbean and the American South, enslaved Africans produced the sugar, coffee, and cotton that enriched Europe. The cruelty was systematic, but resistance never ceased. Enslaved people preserved their cultures through music, religion, and language, creating enduring legacies in the Americas. Yet even amid oppression, there was cultural fusion. African rhythms influenced Caribbean music, American crops like maize and potatoes transformed European diets. From Asia came tea and porcelain, from the Americas, chocolate and tobacco. The world's tables, tastes, and economies became entangled, an unintended tapestry woven from both suffering and exchange. By the late 17th and early 18th centuries, trade had become truly global. Silver from the mines of Potosi in modern Bolivia flowed to Seville and Manila, where it was exchanged for Chinese silk and porcelain. The Spanish galleon trade connected Acapulco to Manila, linking the Americas and Asia across the Pacific for the first time. Sugar, tobacco, tea, coffee, and cotton became the first global consumer goods. European households grew dependent on colonial products, and a new middle class emerged, defined by consumption. This vast commercial network reshaped economies everywhere. Asia remained vital, India produced textiles and spices, China exported luxury goods, and Japan traded silver and lacquerware. Africa supplied labor and raw materials, while the Americas provided land and crops. Europe acted as the central node, controlling credit, shipping, and manufacturing. The planet had never been so interconnected. But behind this web of commerce lay vast imbalances, between colonizer and colony, rich and poor, master and slave. By the mid-18th century, the world was shifting again. The very system that had enriched Europe began to strain under its contradictions. Mercantilism stifled competition, colonies sought independence, and new ideas, the Enlightenment, free trade, and human rights, began to challenge old hierarchies. In Britain, the Industrial Revolution was transforming production. Machines replaced manual labor, and demand for raw materials surged. Colonies became both sources of supply and captive markets. In America, colonial resentment grew over British trade restrictions, leading to revolution in 1776. Across the Atlantic, enslaved Africans in Haiti rose in rebellion, creating the first free black republic in 1804. Meanwhile, thinkers like Adam Smith argued against mercantilism, advocating for free markets and less state interference. His 1776 book The Wealth of Nations heralded a new economic philosophy, one that would dominate the coming century. The age of mercantilist empires was ending, but the global system they had built, of interconnected economies, labor flows, and global markets, would survive, evolving into modern capitalism. By the close of the 18th century, the global trade revolution had reshaped the world. What began as a series of daring voyages had become a vast, interlinked system of empire and exchange. European nations, once small and fragmented, now ruled continents. Their ships crisscrossed oceans, their languages and laws spread across the globe, and their hunger for resources reshaped entire ecosystems. But this revolution carried a dual legacy. On one hand, it connected humanity as never before, spreading technologies, ideas, and goods that enriched cultures and economies. On the other, it entrenched systems of exploitation, slavery, colonization, and inequality, whose effects persist to this day. The global economy that emerged in the 16th to 18th centuries laid the foundation for the modern world. Industrialization, global markets, and transnational corporations all trace their roots to this age. The silver mined in the Andes, the spices of the Indies, and the sugar of the Caribbean formed the first truly worldwide network of wealth and power. As empires rose and fell, the world learned a hard truth, that trade, like history itself, is never neutral. It can bind nations together or tear them apart. It can create prosperity, but also suffering. The global trade revolution was both a triumph of human ingenuity and a tragedy of human greed, a story written across oceans, continents, and centuries. And so, from the ashes of conquest and the sails of exploration, the modern world was born.